All right, we'll say good morning. Let's begin. We have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem. Good. Today's daf is Mem Vav 46. We are picking up Mem Hayam with Beis 45b at the Mishnah, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines up from the bottom. Says the Mishnah, Kolin is Skalin Nitlin. It will say after a person is stoned, so the body is hung. Hung. The body is hung. Right? Calling a skull and nitlin. Div Rabbi Eliezer. So we'll say these are the words of Rabbi Eliezer. Whoever experiences skila is hung afterwards. V'cham v'cham say eno nitla ela hamegadef va'oved avodah zara. The Chachamim say the only people whose bodies are hung after stoning are the individuals who either go ahead and are killed because they cursed HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or one who worshipped avodah zara. We'll discuss again where the Chachamim get this from. Ha'ish told him also panav klape ha'am. So when the body of a man is hung, so ultimately again he faces the people. Va'isha paneh klape ha'etz. But a woman, her body faces ultimately again towards the post upon which she is hung. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. The Chachamim say ha'ish nitla. Ve'in ha'isha nitla. So both this goes back to yesterday's daf. The Chachamim say only a man is hung, a woman is never hung, even after skila. And both say, remember again, we saw already in yesterday's daf, the Rambam paskins, we paskin like this statement of the Chachamim, that only a man is hung, a woman is not hung. Al tznius. So the Gemara says the following: Shimon ben Shetach Omer, Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, Valo Shimon ben Shetach Tolan Nashim ba'Ashkelon. But Shimon ben Shetach went ahead and executed, again, this was the big Rashi that I told you that I owe you. Shimon ben Shetach executed 80 women who were engaged in kishuf, were engaged in sorcery. And he hung them. Right, is that the right? They hung them. Okay, good. He hung them, ultimately, again, all 80 in one day. All 80 in one day. So the Gemara says, Amrulo shmonim nashim tala. So first of all, again, it was 80 women. Ve'ein danin shnayim b'yom echad. And in general, again, we do not go ahead and execute, we do not judge 2 capital cases in one day. Which is another way of the Mishnah saying, don't bring any rayas from Shimon ben Shetach, because Shimon ben Shetach, that case was an outlier. Okay, so we'll discuss it. Ten Rabbanim. So the Gemara quotes over here the following: V'humas v'talisa. The pasuk says, you will kill him and you will hang him. Yachol kalamum sin nitlin. I might have thought that anyone who is executed by Beis Din is automatically hung. Talmud lomar ki killas elokim talui. The pasuk says, because the killas elokim, the degradation or the curse of God, is hung. So we'll say, what does that refer to? This refers that pasuk is referring to the one who is executed because he cursed HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Just like the one who curses HaKadosh Baruch Hu is killed with skila, and he is hung afterwards. Afkol shebeskila. Anyone who is killed by stoning is subsequently hanged. Divi Rabbi Eliezer. These are the words ultimately again of Rabbi Eliezer. So also Rabbi Eliezer says, therefore you see this connection, ultimately only those who are killed with skila as a result, ultimately again, of cursing HaKadosh Baruch Hu and avodah zara, you understand, comes into the same category. They're both a denial of the existence of God. The Chum say, that's what it is. Chum say, Ma mekalel zeh shekafar be'ikr, af kol shekafar be'ikr. So I'm sorry, what I just said refers to the Chachamim. Rabbi Eliezer darshans, anytime a person is killed by skila, so the body is hung afterwards. The Chachamim say no, that anyone who is killed because ultimately again they were kofar be'ikr. The Rebbe said kofar be'ikr means they deny the existence of God. There are only 2 cases where a person is killed for being kofar be'ikr. What are the 2 cases? Number 1, a person curses HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and number 2, avodah zara. Both of those are denial of God, and therefore again it's only in those 2 cases where the person is hung. So says the Gemara b'Maikimah. So what are they arguing about? So we'll say what they're arguing about is the exegetical principle through which we darshan these psukim. Rabbanan darshi klali uprati. The Rabbanan darshan klalu prat. So how do they darshan a klalu prat? V'humas vitalisa klal. So we'll say you will go ahead and you will kill him and you will hang him. This is a general principle. Ki kilalas, because again I will say the phrase ki kilalas alokim talui, right? Literally the curse of God is hanging. Prat, that refers to a specific statement. Ihav makavi lahadadi. Since these two phrases were right next to each other, arminan ein bechlal alamash shebeprat. I would have said that Rabbi say in general again, the klal is only comprised of that which is included in the prat. Hani in midi achrini lo. Only these, i.e., megadev, cursing God, and avodah zarah, are included in the obligation of hanging. But other situations where a person is executed, he's not hanged afterwards. To which the Gemara says, "Ta'atav of memvav hashta demercha kimihadadi." But now that the two phrases, in fact, are distanced from one another, ahani l'rabuye avodos kachavim. Ultimately, again, it comes to include avodos kachavim as well, avodah zarah. Didami le bechol midi, because also avodah zarah resembles the case of megadef. Rabbi Eliezer darish ribuy umiute. Rabbi Eliezer, on the other hand, darshins ribuy umiut. What's the ribuy umiut? So vohumas vitalisa ribuy. You will kill him and you will hang him. This is a ribuy. Ki kilalas elokim. Ki kilalas elokim tai miut. This is an exclusionary phrase. Ihavu mekavi lahadadi. If the two phrases were right next to each other, lo havu marbinan ela avodas kochavim dedamla b'chamidi. I would have only included avodah zarah, because avodah zarah ultimately resembles megadef in every way. Hashda demercha kimihadadi. Now that they are distanced, ahani lerabuye shar niskalim. It comes to include other people who are killed ultimately again by skila, that they are also hanged as well, also hung as well. So we'll say, how do we paskin? So interestingly enough, we paskin ultimately again like the Chachamim, that halacha l'maisa, the only people who are hung are people who are executed because of megadef and avodah zarah. Only those who are executed because they curse God or because they worship idolatry, those bodies are hung after they're executed. I want to be clear. What the Mishnah is referring to, Rabbi say, is the person is not killed through hanging. And we're going to see that. It's actually very interesting. They're killed through stoning. After they're killed through stoning, we hang the body. That only applies in the two specific cases of megadef and avodah zarah. Other cases of skila, it will not apply. So it says the Gemara the following: Ha'ish tolin, my time in the Rabbanan. So we'll say, the Gemara says the following: what's the reason of the Rabbanan? So remember again, the Chachamim say that only a man is hung, a woman is not. So it says the Gemara, my time in the Rabbanan, Amakra v'talisa oso. Pasuk says you shall hang him oso v'lo osa. The Chachamim darshan him and not her. Rabbi Eliezer, oso below ksuso. Rabbi Eliezer, so that's yesterday's daf. He says, no, oso is not supposed to be gender specific. Oso means you only stone the individual to exclude what? To exclude his clothing. So Rabbanon inachinami. The Rabbanon, now Rabbi say the Rabbanon agree with that, by the way, that you also remove the clothing of the individual. Ela amar kra v'chiyeh beish chet ish v'lo isha. The Rabbanon dash another pasuk. The pasuk says when a man will have a sin in him, he will be hung afterwards. V'lo isha. So again, not a woman. Rabbi Eliezer, hi v'chiyeh beish my darish bei. What does Rabbi Eliezer do with this pasuk? Amar Reish Lakish is amazing because it's halacha ma'aseh this week's parsha. Hahu lemeute ben sorar umora. That comes to exclude ben sorar umora from the obligation from hanging. So the Gemara says v'hatanya ben sorar umora niskal v'nitla divrei Rabbi Eliezer. But one second, the Brisa says, you both say, this is Rabbi Eliezer l'shitaso, who says what? Everyone who is stoned is subsequently hanged. So therefore he will hold that ben sorar umora ultimately will be hung as well. So the Gemara says, one second, we have a contradiction, because Rabbi Eliezer just darshan ki yihya beish. Ish means a man is subject to hanging, but what? A boy, right? Which would be a ben sorar umora, is not. Yet the Brisa says that according to Rabbi Eliezer, a ben sorar umora is in fact hung. Ela amrav Nachman by Yitzchak l'Rabos ben sorar umora. So ultimately, Nachman says you're right. A ben sorar umora is hung as well. My time the amar kra v'chiyeh beish chet ish v'lo ben. So ultimately, again, ish means chet misha al chet o neherag yatsa ben sorar umora sha'al sofo neherag. Oh, suppose to listen to this. See, interestingly enough, when it comes to this pasuk, we're going to see what we have is what we call a miut achar miut. Two exclusionary phrases. When the pasuk says v'chiyeh beish chet, so we darshan ish v'lo ben. That refers to a man and not a boy. Number 2, chet, it says he's executed for his sin. We dash from that, someone who is executed for his sin. Now this comes to exclude Ben Sora and Mora. Both say, remember again, Ben Sora and Mora is the great novelty. Why is that the great novelty? Because the Ben Sora and Mora is not really executed for what he's done, but rather he's executed, why? For what we know he will become. Remember, all he's done is he's stolen some money and he's bought meat and wine. That is not an offense punishable by death. We kill him, the Gemara says, because we know that he's going to ultimately become an individual who is going to steal and rob and kill other individuals. So the Gemara says, what do you see from here? Have miyut achamiyut. This is 2 exclusionary phrases in a row. Ve'emiyut achamiyut ela l'rabos. And I will say one of the exegetical principles is that when you have a miyut achamiyut, 2 exclusionary phrases, one after the other, that comes to include something else. In this case, what does it come to include? It comes to include ultimately, again, it comes to include Ben Sora Moreh, that in fact he is hung. We'll say, so amazingly enough, it's just the way the exegetical principles work. We have 2 exclusionary phrases, both that seem to exclude Ben Sora Umoreh from the obligation of hanging, yet because they are 2 repetitive exclusionary phrases, miyot achar miyot l'rabos, comes to include Ben Sora more hanging. Incredible. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Valoshem ben Shadach Talanashim. Rabbi Eliezer says, but one second, he says, the Chum say, we only hang men, we don't hang women. See, who says Judaism is a misogynistic religion? You see, right? We only hang men, we don't hang women. So Rabbi Eliezer says to Chachamim, what about the case of Shimon ben Shetach? Shimon ben Shetach, he hanged those 80 sorceresses, right? Those 80 women in one day. So Amar Rav Chisda, lo shanu ela b'shtei misos. When do we say that Beis Din does not execute 2 people in one day? That's only if they're being executed with 2 different forms of execution. Aval b'misa achos danin. But l'maisa, again, if they have 2 cases with the same death penalty, then ultimately, again, they will try both of those cases in one day. But yet there was the case of Shimon Shetach, where all 80 women were executed in the same way. And yet again, we see that case was an outlier, that was something that would not be normally done, even though again, all these women were being executed in the same way. Ella, itmar hachi itmar. Rather, this is what you have to say. Lo shana ella b'misa achos ke'in shtei misos. Beis Din only will try 2 capital cases in one day and execute 2 people in one day. If it's 1 misa, that's like 2 misos. What does that mean? Vehechi dami. What's the case, Rabbosai? Kigon shtei averos. So we'll say, if you look at Rashi for just a moment, it's 2, 4, 5 lines up from before Rashi gets wide. Misa achas kein shtei misos kigon shtei averos she'ein domos vehi misa achas. So we'll say Beis Din will adjudicate 2 capital cases as long as what? They are 2 dissimilar averos, but with the same death penalty. What's an example of 2 dissimilar averos with 1 death penalty? It could go on Shabbos v'avodah zara. So both Shabbos and avodah zara carry with them a same penalty of skila. Same penalty of skila. So the Gemara says over here, Beis Din will go ahead and adjudicate 2 cases with the same death penalty when it's 2 different infractions. Beis Din will not adjudicate 2 cases, even if they have the same misa, if they're 2 distinct averos. But I will say, if there are 2 cases for the same infraction and the same death penalty, then Einachinami Beis Din will adjudicate that case. So I will say, where the Gemara seems to be holding right now is the following. When do we say that Beis Din doesn't judge 2 cases? Obviously, if it's 2 dissimilar cases, Beis Din won't judge 2 capital cases in one day. But even if both of the cases have the same death penalty, but they're different infractions, we won't judge those 2 in one day either. The only time there's a possibility for Beis Din paskening on 2 capital cases in one day is when it's mamish 2 of the same case. First, 2 people committed the same avera, and therefore ultimately again same infraction, same death penalty. Masir Ravad Bar raised the kasha. Ein dan shnaya bayom va'afilu noef v'no efes. But 1 second, the Brisa says that a Beis Din cannot condemn 2 people, can't go ahead and give out 2 death sentences in one day, even with an adulterer and an adulteress. Now what this seems to be saying is the following. Let's say two people are brought to Beis Din, a man and a woman. Why? Because they both committed an act of adultery together. Same Avera, and presumably what? Same Misa. Now, based on what we just said, same Avera, same death penalty, what should be the halacha? Beis Din should be able to adjudicate both the cases. Yet we see, the Gemara says, the Brite says, that we wouldn't adjudicate those two capital cases on the same day. To which the Gemara says, Gemara Chista, the Bas Kohen Bo'ala. Oh, Rabbi say, what's the case? There's an interesting case if a Bas Kohen commits adultery. So we'll say there's a special Gzeras HaKasav. She is killed with Sreifa, even though, again, the man is killed either with Skila or Chenek, depending on her particular status. But it's one of the interesting anomalies where the woman gets a different punishment than the man. So the Gemara says that could be the case, where even though they're both showing up at Beis Din for the same Avera, and by the way, the same Avera they committed with one another, because their death sentences will be different, Beis Din will not rule on both of those capital cases in one day. The Bas Kohen v'zomamei zomameha. Or Rabbi will say in the case, and again we're not going to get into the intricacies over here, but if you have witnesses who testify about a Bas Kohen who went ahead and committed adultery, then what? You have Eidim who come and make the first set of witnesses Eidim Zomamin, and then ultimately you have a third set of witnesses who make the second set of witnesses Zomamin, who reinstate the first set of witnesses into regular Eidim. Ultimately, again, the Eidim Zomamin and the Eidim Zomamin will get a different Misa than the Isha would have. The point the Gemara is trying to make over here is that when the Brisa says we don't execute two people in one day, even an adulterer and adulteress, that contradicted what we said before. That Beis Din will hand down two death penalties when both cases are the same Avera and the same punishment. So what do we do with this Brisa that says we won't kill the adulterer and the adulteress in the same day? The Gemara understands that to be referring to a very specific case of adultery where the circumstances are such that the adulterer and the adulteress are receiving two different punishments. Good. Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ben Yaakov Omer, Shamati sheBeis Din makin va'onshin shlomo naTorah. Both says very interesting. I have heard, I will say, a number of you have asked me this question over time. When we have cases where Beis Din can't technically punish someone, but it's clear that the guy's a bad guy. You know, you have cases like this, I will say, where somebody has done something illegal, but for whatever reason, or I should say something different. You know the guy's a bad guy. He's just a bad guy. I don't mean like making a personal judgment. I mean like Beis Din knows the guy's bad, but for whatever reason we can't punish him within a legal framework because whatever the issue is. The Gemara now is talking about what we'll call the long arm of the law. Beis Din has a long arm. The Gemara says, Shemati sheBeis Din makin va'onshin shlomo naTorah. Beis Din has the right to go out and give malchus, as well as level out other punitive measures. Shlomo naTorah. But shlomo naTorah means even when the Torah does not demand it. V'lo la'avar al divrei Torah. Now the Beis Din doesn't do this in order to violate Torah law. Ela kedei lasos siag laTorah. Rather, again, only in order to go ahead and make a protective fence around Torah. So Beis Din, I will say, has, in other words, what the Gemara is pointing out over here is that Beis Din has the right to punish when necessary, when they see ultimately, again, that the collective needs are served through the administering of this punishment. So the Gemara actually gives examples of this. There was once a guy who was riding a horse on Shabbos during the days of the Greeks. Uskaluhu. They brought him to Beis Din and they stoned him. And not because riding an animal on Shabbos ultimately deserves skila, but the hour demanded it. We'll say, what does that mean? So we know, are you allowed to ride an animal on Shabbos? The halacha is no. Why can't you ride an animal on Shabbos? So it's Gzeira D'Rabbanan. It's Gzeira D'Rabbanan that ultimately, again, a person may come to break off a branch in order to go ahead and hit the animal to get it to move. So again, riding an animal on Shabbos is also D'Rabbanan. Certainly not a death penalty. Malchus, you can get Malchus for it. So why do they do it? So remember, the Gemara gives us the context. This was the days of the Yevanim. The Yevanim, we know, the Greek Hellenists wanted to outlaw, Antiochus outlawed a number of things, amongst them Shabbos. There was an active effort to undermine the sanctity of Shabbos. This Jew was publicly flaunting Shabbos, was publicly violating Shabbos. So therefore, again, the Beis Din took it upon themselves to execute him. Why? Because they felt it was important in order to go ahead and safeguard the sanctity and severity of Shabbos in the eyes of the populace. So we'll say this is the long arm of the law. Another example. There was another man. Now I will say, this is a married couple, and he had relations with his wife under the fig tree. In other words, the case over here is he had relations in public. Now, lav dafka in the middle of the street. It was under the tree, so it was a little bit removed, but it was something that was considered to be a breach of tznius. It was a breach of normative modesty standards. They brought him to Beis Din, and he got malchus. Now, we'll say, what's the prohibition involved with a man having relations with his wife underneath a fig tree? And the answer is none. I mean, it's none. There's not a Isad Haraisa, there's not a Isad Rabbanon, right? Again, so what's happening here? To which the Gemara understands this was an issue. There's no side conversations about this, by the way, right? There's no right? So the Gemara says over here, the Gemara says, but Chazal, the Rabbanon felt that this was an incredible breach. Now, what the other societal circumstances that were happening at this time, I don't know. But Lamaisa, whatever it was, you can understand that this is a brazen breach of modesty, even though it's not usher. But again, Chazal felt the need to step in and to flog the guy, to give him malchus. So the Gemara goes weiter. Right, fine. Mishnah. Keita told also. So we'll say this is amazing. So what's the process for hanging the individual? Now that we've established, Rabbosai, that first of all, the only people who are hanged are the individuals who are executed from a gadif and avodah zarah. So only cases of where you curse God and where you worship idolatry. Those are the only cases where a person is hanged. In all other cases, he's not. Only a man is hanged, a woman is not. So the Gemara says, "Keitza tolen also." So how do we go ahead and administer hanging? So says the Mishnah. Mishakin es hakora ba'aretz. So we take a pole, we put the pole into the ground. Va'etz yotzei, and again I will say, so you have the pole that's into the ground, and you put another pole across the top of that pole. Va'etz yotzei. Now boss, remember again, as we've discussed, hanging is not one of the forms of misas Beis Din. A body is only hung after the person is already executed. Therefore, I think, and I will tell you, until I learned this Mishnah, my conception of hanging was always, how do you hang a body? Right? You put a noose around the neck and you hang the body. That's not how they hung misas. People were killed by babies. Listen to this. Makif shtei yadav zu al gavzu. So you tie, the person's already dead. You tie their hands together. Vitola also. And you hang the individual by their hands. Plus, I was amazed by this. So I started last night that I was eating dinner with my family. I started saying over this Mishnah because I was so intrigued by this. I get a sudden kick under the table by my wife because my kids are turning pale at the table. I was so struck by this. I was so struck by this because, again, I don't know why. I didn't remember this Mishnah from before, but it's so dramatic. It's just, you don't think about that this is how the person is hanged. But, okay, anyway, the point is, it's not good dinner table conversation. That's the take-home message on this. Not on Shabbos, not weekday, never. Good. Rabbi Yossi says, Hakora muta ala kosel, v'tola osek iderach shat habachin osin. So also listen to this. And we'll discuss what the nature of the machlokes over here is. Rabbi Yossi says, we do not take the pole and put it into the ground. Instead, what we do is, we take the pole and we lean it against a wall. Now what you would do is, again, and then you would go ahead and you would hang the person from that point where ultimately the wall, the beam hits the wall. Now the image that he gives is the same way that the butchers hang meat. So the same way apparently the butchers used to hang meat by taking a beam, leaning it against the wall, and you would hang the meat from there. Now, here's the amazing part. We hang the individual for just a few moments. We hang him We're Yotzei, the mitzvah, because again, there's a biblical obligation to hang those who ultimately are stoned, at least in those specific situations. We hang him, and Matirin Osumiyad, then we take down the body immediately. V'imlan, if you leave the body hanging overnight, over alav below sase, you violate the prohibition. Shneemar, lo salin nivlaso ala eitz, ki kabar tik berenu, ki kilalas elokim talui. That ultimately, again, if you leave him hanging overnight, so you violate the prohibition, because the pasuk says, do not leave the body hanging overnight, ki kabar tik berenu, bury him immediately, because literally, kilalas elokim talui, the degradation of God is hanging. Kilomar, mipnei mazet talui, why is this one hanging? Why was this one hung? Mipnei sheberach es Hashem. Ultimately, again, because he cursed God. Remember, again, this is reflecting the idea that hanging is only administered to those who are killed because of either cursing God or avodah zarah. So therefore, again, if somebody's hanging, at the end of the day, it's a reminder that there's a Jew who cursed HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what it means, ki kilalas elokim talui. There's a reminder that there was a Jew who cursed HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's a degradation to the individual, a degradation to God. Nimtza Shem Shai Mischalal. Rabbi Meir, B'shah Adam Mitztar, Shechina Maloshan Omeres. This is amazing. So Rabbi Meir says, at a time when a person is in distress, and again, we'll discuss what all of this means. Sha'adam Mitztar, Rashi says, Sheparanus ba'a alav ba'ono, that he suffers. The person suffers. What does the Shechina say? Maloshan Omeres, Kalani miroshi, Kalani mizro'ai. That ultimately, again, literally, my head has become light, my limbs have become light. If you look at Rashi for just a moment, Rashi says, it's 4 lines up from the bottom, Kalani meroshi kiloma kimosha adam shiyage va'ayef omer roshi kaved alai uzroi kaved alai hainu kilalas kal les ani eni kal. So ultimately, again, we're going to discuss this lashon over here. Kalani seems to be a contraction of kal less. When a person is tired, a person is exhausted, his head feels heavy, his limbs feel heavy. So when a person suffers and life feels heavy on him, his body feels heavy, his circumstances feel heavy, the Ribono Shel Olam says, I feel your heaviness as well. Kalani miroshi, kalani mizro'ai. When you feel heaviness, I feel heaviness as well. An incredible idea. So the Gemara goes weiter. Im kein hamakom mitztar al damen shel rishon shenishbach, kal v'chomer al damen shel tzadikim. So if the Ribono Shel Olam has distress over the rishon who are executed, all the more so how he has distress when the tzaddikim suffer as well. V'lozu bilvad amru ela kol hamalin es meso. They're both saying, now the Gemara is jumping back for just a moment. The same way that you can't leave a body hanging overnight, even Rabbi say not in the case of execution, where a person dies, you cannot leave, or you should not leave, a person who has died unburied overnight. And if a person does so, over below sase, he violates a prohibition. However, halinu l'chvodo, the Rebbe is amazing. If you left the body unburied overnight, alts kavod ames, right, for cover for the deceased. For example, lahavi lo aron v'tachrichem, because you don't have a casket or you don't have shrouds, eino over alav. Then ultimately, again, you do not violate the prohibition. This is a very important halacha, because there are times where we will, in general, we try not to go ahead and delay a levaya at all. But again, if there is a need to delay, alts kavod ames. Now again, generally kavod ames today manifests itself in the ability for certain close relatives to be able to get there for a levaya. So we'll do so, and that's not considered to be halanas ames, because again, it's kavod ames. Again, we'll get into the scope of this. So the Gemara goes back to v'lo covered also, back to the guy who was stoned and then hung. So the Gemara said, v'lo covered also b'kirvos avosaf. When they took him down from the post, they would not bury him in a family plot. Ella shtei batik varas hayu mitukan lebezdin achos lenegev ragiv lenechnakin ve'achos leniskal v'nisrafin. Bezdin had 2 cemeteries, one for those who were killed by hereg and chenek, by a sword and by strangulation, and the other for those who were killed by stoning and by burning. They would bury the individual in one of these cemeteries. Afterwards, nesach el habasar, once the body decomposed, melaktin es ha'atzamos, family members would then collect the bones of the deceased family member. The kovrno sobim koma. So we'll say the body had to be buried in one of the Bezdin cemeteries. When the body decomposed, they did what's called likot atzamos. We learned this, if you remember, again back in our Moed Cotton days. They gathered up the bones, buried the bones in family plots. The kovrno sobim koma. That krovim. This is first of all, take a look at the last Rashi. Nisachel habasar kivar niskaper b'misaso. once the body decomposes, the person who was killed by Beis Din, his kapara, his atonement is complete. Meaning, his death is part of his atonement, the decomposition of his body is the other part of atonement, and therefore once the body is decomposed, his kapara is complete, ubizyono, his degradation is complete, therefore they could take his bones and bury it in a family plot. This is amazing, get ready for this. Vakrovim, the relatives of the person who was killed by Beis Din, Ba'im v'shalim b'shalom hadayanim u'b'shalom ha'edim. They have to go out of their way to go ahead and inquire about the welfare, to give a shalom aleichem to the dayanim and to the edim who were involved in the case that ultimately executed their loved one. Kilomar she'ein b'libeinu aleichem, to show we have no tightness against you, right? We have absolutely no problems with you. Shedin emes dantem, because you adjudicated a proper case, you judged correctly. So fine. We'll say first of all, again, we'll discuss that halacha because that's exceptionally dramatic. However, we'll say you do not observe shiva for someone who is executed by Beis Din. However, aval onenim. But I will say now we'll discuss what this means. Onenim means, but you grieve. You're permitted to grieve for a loved one, even if they were executed by Beis Din. She'ein aninus ela balev, because grieving is only done in the heart. When they say lo hayu misavlin means there were no mourning practices, no shiva, nothing like that. Aninus over here refers to feeling grief in your heart. You can't legislate ultimately again how a person feels. So obviously they're going to grieve for their loved one. Take a look at Rashi. Tap Rashi mevav amades. V'lo hayim misavlin alein kedei shetihei bizyonan kapara lahen ela onin bilvad de'ein zakava laharuk vein kaparos on the nasbakach she'inaninos ela b'leiv bilvad. So we'll say part of the reason we will discuss why they did not observe avelis, they didn't observe shiva, was because that was part of the degradation of the person who was executed, and that's part of his kapara. Incredible Mishnah. All right, let's explain it. If the pasuk would have said he sinned and he was stoned, I would have said first the body is hung, and then only afterwards do they execute him with skila. In other words, I would have thought first you hang him, and then if he's not killed through hanging, then you kill him with stoning. Apparently this was the way that the government in the times of the Gemara used to execute people. They would first hang them, and if you didn't die through the hanging, then they would stone you. Therefore the pasuk says he will be executed and you will hang him. B'misin also, first you execute the individual, v'achar kach tolen also. Then you go ahead and you hang him. Keitzad, so the Gemara says, how does this work? Mashin also alishkes chamer. We'll say this is amazing. They would delay the execution of a person until right before sunset. The gomer as dino, then they would go ahead and they would pass judgment, they would deliver the verdict. Umamisin also, they would execute him right then and there. Now again, we discussed in the previous Mishnayos that there clearly was some level of time delay. Because remember, again, the Beis Haskila was not right next to the Beis, and you had to get... So whatever it means, the point is they tried to do everything late in the day, and you'll see why this is. Umamisin also, the achakach tolen also. So they execute him through stoning, and then they hang the body. Now what's the halacha? Echad kosher, the echad matir. One person ties the body, right? Meaning one person hangs the body, another person unties the body. Kedelakayim mitzvahs tzaliyah. In order ultimately again to be makayim the mitzvah of hanging. They both say, why do they do this right before Shkia? Why right before sunset? Because they both say, remember again, once the sun sets, you can't leave the body hanging anymore. So apparently it appears that they would hang the body literally for just a couple of moments. On one hand, to fulfill the biblical obligation. On the other hand, to try to go ahead and minimize the bizayon to the deceased, the embarrassment to the deceased. So the Gemara says, Tanra Abanan. 8. The pasuk says that you will go ahead and hang the person upon an 8. V'talisa oso ala 8. They will say, now 8, the pashtus, 8 can mean a lot of things. 8 can mean wood, but 8 could also mean what? Tree. So shomea ani bein b'talish mechuber. So maybe it means whether the pole upon which you are hanging him is talush, is something attached to the ground, like a tree, or mechuber, or something that's not attached, but you attached it, like the pole that you plunge into the ground. Talmud ki kabor. But then the pasuk says, ki kavar tik barenu. So remember, the way the pasuk reads is, lo salin nivlaso al ha'it. do not leave the body on the tree. Ki kabar tikberenu bayomahu. Bury him that day. Bury him that day. I will say, we're going to see what the Gemara is going to darshan is. We darshan the same way that you bury the individual. Watch this. I'm sorry, just lost the place. Tamulomar ki kabar. So we'll say, the way the Gemara is going to darshan is, not only do you bury the individual, but you have to bury the beam with which he was hung with him as well. Which makes sense, because what did we say before? We learned in yesterday's daf that all of the implements of execution are buried along with the individual, right? In the Dalet Amos of his grave. Even though he is not executed through hanging, but because that is part of the process of his execution, that beam, or those two beams, are buried along with him. Therefore, again, we learn, that you hang him on something that is only missing burying. If you were to hang him on a tree, that wouldn't work. Why? Because it would first have to be cut down and then buried. So we'll say, so we just learned, therefore, you hang him upon something that can be simply taken out of the ground, but not something that requires to be cut down from the ground. Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi says, you hang him on something that is only missing kvura. So Rabbi Yossi takes us a step further. Remember, what did Rabbi Yossi? How do you hang him? You take a beam and you lean it against the wall. What's the chilik between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim? The Chachamim are saying you take a beam and you plunge it into the ground. Rabbi Yossi is saying, no, that's too much of a process as well, because that requires you, then after the hanging is complete, to uproot the beam. Therefore, Rabbi Yossi says the beam has to be immediately buryable, right after, again, the act of hanging has taken place. The Rabbanan will say the act of taking the beam out of the ground is totally insignificant, and therefore, again, they hold that you put the beam in the ground. Kolomar, mipnei ma zet taloi, mipnei sheberach. Tanya, Omer Rabbi Meir, mashalo mashal. So Rabbi Meir said, let me give you a mashal. Ultimately, again, to what, meaning why is it that we take the body down so quickly? And what does it mean? Ki kilalas elokim taloi. He says, l'shnei achim tu'umim. We'll say this can be compared to two brothers who are twins. Bi'ir achas, and both of the brothers live in one city. Echad minu melech ve'echad yatzal listus. We'll say one brother became king, and another brother became a robber. Tziva hamelech v'talo. So what happens? One of the brothers, ultimately, again, the thief brother, was found guilty of a crime, and therefore subsequently hung. So whoever sees the thief hanging, he looks exactly like who? He looks exactly like the king. So whoever walks by is going to say, "Ay, the king has been hanged." So says the Gemara, "Siva hamelech boriduhu." The king therefore commanded that the body be taken down. I will say now, what's the yesod ultimately again of the mashal? Rashi says, "L'shnei tu'umim af adam asay b'diyuk no shamakon." I will say it's actually a very beautiful idea. Man is made in the image of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when man is hanging, kiviyachol, the Ribono, part of the Ribono Shalom is hanging as well. Therefore, there's a mitzvah d'oraisa. We do it, but we do it quickly. We take the body down immediately. Really, because the Gemara says of the bizayon, of the degradation to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Gemara goes right to Amr Rabbi Meir, my mashma. So Rabbi Meir, so what's the inference over here? Amr Abaye kiman da'amar kal les. So we'll say, remember again, the Gemara over here is quoting Rabbi Meir's statement, and Rabbi Meir said, Bishash adam mitztar, when a person is in distress, shchina ma'omeres, kalani meroshi, kalani mezroi. Now, the Rabbi Meir is making a drasha on the word kilalas elokim. What does it mean, kilalas elokim? Kalani meroshi, kalani mezroi. So what does that mean? Says the Gemara, Maimash, Amar Abaye, Keman da'amar kal les. Kilalas is like one who says kales. Kales means it is not light. My head is not light. My body is not light, which is another way of saying my head feels very heavy. My body feels very heavy, which Rabbi says is a lashon of distress. Amalei Rabba, so I don't understand. Imkein kaved alai roshi, kaved alai zroimi boile. Why don't you just say my head is very heavy, my body is very heavy? Why do you have to say kilalas kal les? It is not light. To which the Gemara says, Allah Amar Rava, Keman da Amar Kil Li Alma. It's like one who says the world, it's like one who says the world ultimately again is very light to me. What does it mean? I will say Kali Alma and Semechana ve'eni rotze lahaskir kvedos ba'atzmi. We'll say sometimes when a person feels overwhelmed, so instead of saying the world feels like it's crushing down on me, they'll use a metaphorical expression of the world is very light on me. To which the Gemara says, "Haimi ba'ilei legufa." But 1 second, I need that pasuk both say to teach me a general principle that a person is only executed or a person is only hanged for situations where they curse HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like Avodah Zarah or Megadef. If that's the case, to which the Gemara says, "Im kein kra mekalel." My kilalas, ve'ema kuli lahach yudasa. So as I said, the entire pasuk comes to teach you this drasha. Imkeim nema kra kilas. My kilalas. Why does he use the expanded lashon? Shma min atarti. Therefore, we'll say from kilas we're learning two things. Number one, that the only people who are hanged are individuals who curse Hakadosh Baruch Hu, i.e., avodah zarah and megadef. And number two, I will say, we learn this idea that when the person is in distress, the Shechina is in distress as well. So we learn this incredible yisod, that when even the Rasha is in distress, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Kilalas Elokim Taloi, Kali Roshi, Kali Zro'ai. When we suffer, HaKadosh Baruch Hu suffers alongside us. For those who bilvad, Amar Rav Yochanan Mishum Rav Shema Yochai, Minayi Lemalanas Meiso She'over Alav Sasei. How do we know that if a person leaves his loved one unburied overnight? How do I know that he's violated the Torah prohibition? Talmud Lomar, ki kavar tik berenu. That again, that halacha is, you have to bury him. You have to bury immediately. Mikan lemalin esmeso she'over below sase. From here we learn that what? That if one goes ahead and leaves his loved one unburied overnight, that ultimately again he is in violation of a lo sase, of a prohibition. Ike de Amr says another version of this exchange. Amr Rabbi Yochanan Mishum B'Shem Yochai Remez l'Kvura Min HaTorah Minai. Both say the others have a different version of this exchange, and in this exchange they're asking the question: from where do we see a scriptural allusion to the idea that we bury dead people? I mean, how do we know that a dead person is supposed to, that a person who dies is supposed to be buried in the earth? From where do we see that concept? Talmud Lomar Ki Kavar Tikvarenu. The pasuk says, "You shall surely bury him." Mikan remez l'kvura min haTorah. From here we see, I will say, a remez. Now again, remember, I will say, what's interesting is the following: the Torah never says, "V'adaber shema Moshe leimor," bury dead people in the earth. The Torah never says that. We're learning it out from an inference. The pasuk says, when you stone someone, you shall hang them. Don't leave the body hanging overnight. Ki kavar tikbarenu bayamahu. You shall bury him on that day. So the Torah is telling us that when you take the body down, you bury it in the ground. So therefore, again, from here we see that the Torah wants it to be that you bury a person in the earth. Amalei Shabar Malka, the Rav Chama. So Rav Shabar Malka, King Shapur, asked Rav Chama the following question. What was the question? Kavura min haTorah minayim. So King Shapur asked Rabbi Chama, where in the Torah does it say that you have to bury a person in the ground? Ishtek v'lo amar le v'lo midi. Rav Chama didn't say anything. He didn't answer. Amar Rav Achar Yaakov, im sar alma biyada titipshoy. Oy, the world has been given over to the hands of the foolish ones. So what Rav Achar is saying is, Rav Chama, why didn't you answer him? The Bailei Lemeimar Ki Kavar. Could have just said the pasuk says Ki Kavar Tikbarenu. You have to bury him. To which the Gemara says, well, maybe Ki Kavar means what? That means you have to put him in a casket. Tikbarenu lo mashmale. So we'll say, so why? So ultimately, again, why didn't Rabbi Chama give this answer? Because he felt that King Shapur would not have accepted this answer. That King Shapur would have said, ultimately again, that Ki Kavor means you have to bury him in a casket, and Tikbarenu, where do you see from that means burial in the earth? How do you know what that means? Therefore again, Rabbi Chama doesn't respond to King Shapur. So I will say, so this is actually very interesting. Why don't you say that we could find a fact that the Torah mandates burial in the ground? How? Because ultimately, again, from tzadiki, tzadiki. So we see throughout the Torah that there are examples of righteous people who are buried in the earth. To which the Gemara says, well, maybe min halga ba'alma. Maybe that's just the minhag. Who says that's an obligation? Maybe just the minhag is that we bury people in the earth. 1 second, but 1 second, the Moshe buried Moshe Rabbeinu, and he buried Moshe in the earth. I mean, he buried Moshe on a mountain, but that's burial in the earth. Maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't want to deviate from the normative minhag. And the normative minhag is we bury people in the earth. But it's a minhag. It's not necessarily a halacha. Toshma. Pasuk says, V'sabtu lo kol Yisrael v'kavru also. So also over here, the Gemara is talking about Avia ben Yeravam. So we'll say the Navi said to Yeravam ben Nevat, who was an incredible Rasha, Melech al Yisrael, the first Melech al Yisrael. He introduced such idolatry into the land, did so many things wrong that the Navi said that his entire family is going to be wiped out. Not only that, they're not even going to merit Kvura. But Yeravam has a son who was righteous. His name was Avia, and Avia was told by the Navi Achia. So there's Avia, who is the son of Yeravam, and Achia Shiloni, who is the Navi. And Achia Shiloni says that Avia, because he was a tzaddik, will be eulogized and properly buried. So what do you see from here? The Navi tells him he's going to be buried in the ground. So you see that we bury people in the ground. To which the Gemara says, Telo yishtani min haga. Maybe that just means that's the minhag. He's giving the bracha that she'll be buried in accordance with the minhag. V'lo yisaptu v'lo yikberu. So ultimately, again, Papa said this is by Yirmiyahu Hanavi speaking to the people of Anatot, right? So the people of Anatot, because they were of the Avodah Zarah, ultimately again it would be wiped out and they wouldn't merit burial. So the Navi said, so we see from here when the Navi says you're going to get punished, not going to merit burial, tells us that what? That burial ultimately again in the ground is a normative thing. The Navi is saying that ultimately, again, they won't be buried in accordance with the minhag. So most like the idea that you see what the Gemara is driving at over here. We're trying to figure out. The Gemara brings a bunch of examples of people who were buried in the ground. The Gemara tries to say, you see that the fact that people are buried in the ground tells us that what? That the halacha is you bury people in the ground. To which the Gemara says, no, maybe not. Maybe all that's saying is that's the minhag. That's the minhag. The minhag was buried on the ground. But lav dafka, that we could see a raya, that there's an obligation to bury people in the ground. So we'll just do one more line and we'll stop here for today. Ibayluhu kvura mishum bizyonahu or mishum kaparu. So when you bury a person in the ground, ultimately again, is that mishum bizayon? In other words, if you look at Rashi, Rashi says mishum bizyonahu shlo yizbaza la'in kol shiru meis v'nyarkav v'nikba, that it will say it would be a bizayon to the deceased and to his family if a body would just sit unburied and would decompose in plain sight. Or mishum kapara, or is the act of burial considered to be a kapara for the deceased? So the Gemara says, now again, how is burial a kapara? Rashi says, we'll say, the greatest sin that sometimes a person contends with in this world is gaiva, is arrogance. So maybe the way we're mechaper for a person's arrogance during this lifetime is how? We bury him deep in the ground. See, I will say here the shaila is burial als kapara for the deceased, or is burial als bizayon for the loved ones. So the Lamain Afkamina, the most Afkamina, listen to this, the Amr lo ba'in and delikbura. Let's say a person leaves in his will, I don't want to be buried. I love my bed. Just leave me on my bed, right? Don't bury me. It's a Tempur-Pedic, Zach. Leave. I want to stay there. Don't go ahead and bury me. So what's the halacha? Say if you say that burial is in order to go ahead and prevent the bizayon, prevent the embarrassment of the family members, even if the deceased leaves explicit instructions not to bury him, we don't have to listen to those instructions because Lamaisa again, it's going to be embarrassing for the family. V'armet mishum kapara. But if you say ultimately again it's mishum kapara, ha'amar lo ba'ina kapara. Person has the right to say, I don't want the kapara. So we'll say, how do we paskin? So again, we'll see tashma ikbor tzadiki. So we'll say, we see the fact that righteous people are buried. V'armet mishum kapara tzadiki la kapara tzvichi. And if you want to say it's about kapara, do righteous people need kapara? So the Gemara assumes the answer is no. To which the Gemara says, of course, in Dechsiv, it's Adam ein tzaddik baretz asher ya'as tov v'lo yacheta. Ultimately, again, I will say there is no such thing as even the most righteous of people who hasn't committed an avera and therefore doesn't need kapara. So I will say the way we paskin ultimately again is burial really serves both of these purposes. Burial serves as a kapara, but burial is also there in order to avoid the bizayon of a family, and therefore even if a person were to leave a tzava'ah in his will that he does not want to be buried, we ignore that tzava'ah because even though he has certain rights legabe himself, he doesn't have the rights to go ahead and cause his family embarrassment. Therefore, we will bury him. But I will say we're going to stop over here, but understand we are still left with our fundamental question, which is what? from where do we know that there's an obligation to bury? We've seen now that there's a minhag to bury. That's the minhag olam. But from where do we see an obligation to bury in the ground? It may Hashem to be continued tomorrow. With the cremations.